There is a man whose death in 1979 was treated as a mundane accident, a commercial flight that crashed a few minutes after taking off from Chicago. 173 passengers, no survivors, and among them, a discreet scientist with an unusual surname who carried within him an equation that official science could not digest. His name was Itzhak Bentov, and most people have never heard of him precisely because what he discovered threatened the world model you have been taught to operate with since childhood. Bentov was not a mystic wrapped in incense. He was a biomedical engineer, a man of instruments, of formulas, of measurements. He invented devices used in hospitals to this day, and it was precisely this brain trained in the rigor of engineering that began to look inside the human body and notice something that no one wanted to admit out loud. The human body is an antenna. The brain is not the producer of reality, it is its tuner. And months after he began presenting this model in public, his plane crashed. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the most disturbing thing is not the death, it is what came after. It is what? Because when his documents were compiled, when the notebooks were organized, when the experiments were translated into a language that intelligence agencies could understand, something happened that today is a documented historical fact. The work of Itzhak Bentov became the scientific basis for a secret CIA program, the so-called Gateway Process, a declassified document that describes, in military jargon, how human consciousness can access information outside of time and space. And at the heart of this document, his name appears, silent, discreet, like someone who knew but was silenced before he finished telling. And that is what we are going to talk about now. About what he saw, about what he measured, and about why, if you understand what follows, the way you perceive your life, your body, and your own mind will never be the same again. Stay with me, because what his wife Myrtala refused to let die with the plane changes everything. Bentov was a refugee. Born in the then Czechoslovakia, a survivor of the horror of the 20th century, he carried within him a question that those who come close to death very early begin to ask, what is in fact real? He went to Israel, helped build medical technology in the middle of a country that was still rising from scratch, and then moved to the United States, where he continued inventing devices, among them the first steerable cardiac catheter, a piece of engineering that saved thousands of lives in surgeries that, before him, were considered impossible. He was, in every technical aspect, the opposite of a charlatan. He was the guy official science should have embraced, and even so he began to bother, because in his laboratory, between oscilloscopes and sensors, he did something no reasonable engineer would do. He began to measure meditators. He began to plug sensors into people who spent hours in silence, sitting with their eyes closed. And what he found was not emptiness, it was the opposite. It was a symphony, a precise biological choreography measured in hertz that started in the heart, rose up the spine, took over the brain, and locked the whole body in a kind of resonance that official physiology did not know how to catalogue. Bentov realized that consciousness was not a vague thing, it was a frequency. And if you could tune the instrument responded, the body responded, and very importantly, the reality around it began to respond as well. That was when his wife, Myrtala, a sculptor, artist, a woman of rare sensitivity, entered as an intellectual partner. She was not decoration, she was a witness and archivist. When Bentov died in the crash of Flight 191 in May 1979, it was she who refused to let his notes rot in a drawer. It was she who organized, published, distributed and protected his legacy. And it is because of her stubbornness that today, decades later, you are hearing this name. Because the truth that Bentov started to weave together was too big to fit into an obituary. He was saying, in mathematical terms, something that mystics had been repeating for 3,000 years, that the entire universe is an image, and that this image is folded inside of you. And this is where his story stops being a biography and becomes physics. Because the second piece of Bentov's puzzle is an idea that is frightening when you truly understand what it means. He argued that the universe is a hologram, and not as a pretty metaphor to post on social media, as a literal structure. If you break a hologram in half, you don't get half the image, you get the whole image, just less sharp. Every fragment contains the whole. And Bentov looked at the cosmos, looked at matter, looked at the human brain and said the most disturbing thing a rigorous scientist can say: this here works in the same way. Every particle, every cell, every thought of yours, it contains within itself information about the entire universe. You are not separated from the cosmos. You are a folded version of it, a living miniature. And the reason you don't perceive this all the time is because your nervous system is tuned to a very narrow frequency band. It's as if you had a radio capable of picking up thousands of stations and spent your entire life stuck on just one, listening to the same commercial on loop called "I need to pay bills," "I need to not be rejected," "I need to not die." This loop screams so loudly that you never hear what is underneath. And what is underneath, according to Bentov, is the holographic structure of reality, a web of information where everything is already there, folded, waiting to be unfolded by your attention. This changes the nature of the question you ask. You stop asking, "How do I get this?" and start asking, "At what frequency does this already exist within me?" You stop trying to pull reality from out there and start to realize that reality is a projection of what is already encoded in your internal field. And that is where we arrive at the point of pain that Bentov understood perfectly, although he almost never spoke of it in public. Most people spend their lives asking for abundance while their bodies are screaming scarcity, asking for love while their nervous systems are locked in rejection, asking for peace while their hearts beat in chronic panic. And the hologram, the field, the universe, call it what you want, does not respond to words. It responds to the vibratory signature of the entire body. It responds to the image you are projecting from the inside out. And if that image is fragmented, distorted, full of noise, what comes back to you is the exact reflection of that noise. It is not punishment. It is a mirror. It is the physics of the hologram doing its job with surgical precision that does not forgive self-deception. You do not receive what you ask for. You receive what you emit. And what you emit is dictated most of the time by unconscious patterns recorded in your body decades ago. That is why Bentov became obsessed with the next step. If the universe is a hologram, and if the human body is a fold of this hologram, then there must be a physical, measurable, biological mechanism that explains how consciousness enters into coherence with this larger field. And this is where his engineering shone. He went to the laboratory, and he began to build one of the strangest and most revealing experiments in the recent history of consciousness science. He built a ballistograph, an instrument capable of measuring the micro-movements of the human body with extreme sensitivity. You sit on it, stay still, breathe, and it records every tiny oscillation of your weight, every pulse, every invisible tremor. And it was there, measuring experienced meditators, that Bentov found something he called the biological signature of the mystical state. He discovered that when a person enters deep meditation, their heart, their brain, their circulatory system, and their entire body begin to oscillate together at a frequency very close to 7 Hertz, 7 pulses per second, a slow, deep rhythm almost inaudible to the world, but absolutely audible to biology. And here comes the part that freezes you. 7 Hertz is approximately the same frequency as the so-called Schumann resonance, the natural frequency of the electromagnetic cavity that exists between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. In other words, when a human being enters deep meditation, they enter into electrical coherence with the planet itself. Their body becomes an extension of the Earth's vibration, and when that happens, strange things start to be measured. The perception of time distorts, pain decreases, intuition skyrockets, and in certain cases the person reports experiences of accessing information they could not possibly have known through ordinary means. Bentov was not speculating. He was reading the chart. And the chart said in no uncertain terms that the human body is not a sack of meat lost in space. It is a resonant instrument finely calibrated to couple with the field around it. The problem is that modern life does absolutely everything to detune this instrument. You wake up with a jolt, cell phone in hand, cortisol gushing. You go through the day in a sequence of micro-traumas, notifications, haste, processed food, artificial light, social media comparisons. Your heart spends most of its time in low variability, which in clinical language means blocked. Your brain gets stuck in high beta, which in clinical language means anxious. And the electrical field that radiates from your body, and yes, this is measured, is a chaotic, noisy field full of mixed signals. You want to attract peace, but your field screams alarm. You want to attract love, but your field screams, I am not safe. You want to attract money, but your field screams, I won't be able to handle it. And the hologram responds to the emission, not the intention. That was exactly what Bentov understood before anyone else. He saw that the so-called expansion of consciousness is not a mental decision, it is a biological re-engineering. You do not think your way out of the pattern. You have to synchronize the body. You have to pull the heart, the brain, and the breath into the same rhythm. And only when this triad enters coherence does the human instrument begin to pick up frequencies that were previously invisible. And that is where we enter the most controversial piece of his theory. The piece that made intelligence agencies quietly take an interest in the work of a biomedical engineer who died in a plane crash. Because Bentov did not stop at 7 Hertz, he went deeper. He began to study Eastern traditions with the same rigor with which he studied circuits, and he found in the ancient description of the so-called Kundalini energy a disturbingly precise correspondence with what his sensors were measuring. Tradition speaks of an energy that sleeps at the base of the spine and that, when awakened, rises up the spine, passes through energy centers, reaches the top of the head, and causes a radical expansion of perception. Mystical description. Ancient language. Bentov looked at this and said, this is a resonance circuit. This is a standing wave traveling through the body. This is the aorta pulsing, the cerebrospinal fluid oscillating, the brain entering phase, the central nervous system being pushed into a state that any engineer would recognize as high-amplitude harmonic oscillation. In other words, what the yogis called awakening, he was seeing appear on the ballistocardiograph. And when this oscillation stabilizes, the side effect reported by those who go through it is always the same, in all cultures, in all centuries. A dissolution of the common sense of time, a perception that the past, the present, and the future coexist, a sensation that the boundary between the self and the world evaporates, and an absolute clarity that consciousness is not a property of the brain. It merely uses the brain as an instrument, much like a hand uses a glove. Bentov was proving with sensors that the mystic and the scientist were talking about the same thing, only in different languages. And if this piece is true, you understand the reason why this type of knowledge has always been guarded. Because a person who knows that the perception of time can be altered, that information can be accessed outside of ordinary channels, and that the internal field generates the external field, is a person who becomes extremely difficult to control by any system that depends on their fear. A person in coherence is a free person, and, historically, power systems do not like free people. But Bentov hadn't yet reached the bottom of the rabbit hole. He was going even further. He began to look at matter itself and ask what sustains all of this. If the body is a vibrational instrument, if the universe is a hologram, if consciousness passes through the brain without being produced by it, then what is this matter that we see, touch, weigh, eat, hurt? His answer was another bombshell. Matter, in Bentov's view, is a temporary vibratory pattern, a foam of oscillations that emerges from a state of absolute rest. He described the real as a game between two poles. On one side, movement. On the other, rest. And every form you see, from the atom to the galaxy, is a dance between these two. Nothing is solid. Everything pulses. Everything is somewhere in the oscillation between the void and manifestation. And most importantly, there is an exact point in the middle of this oscillation where movement ceases for an impossible fraction of an instant, a point of rest, a place between the inhale and the exhale, between the thought that ends and the thought that has not yet begun, between the heartbeat and the next. And it is there, in that microscopic silence, that consciousness touches the absolute. Bentov argued that the deep meditative state trains the body to inhabit this point of rest with increasing frequency. And when that happens, you begin to perceive that all of existence is born from there. Physical reality, with all its apparent hardness, is just the visible trace of an oscillation that emerges from the void and returns to the void millions of times per second. You are not a thing. You are a flicker. And the matter around you is too. The difference between being trapped in pain and being free is literally a matter of where your attention is anchored. If it anchors only in the visible part of the oscillation, you live in appearance. You believe that the world is solid, that the problem is permanent, that the body is you, that personal history is destiny. If it learns to touch the point of rest, even for moments, you begin to experience what ancient texts called grace, a lightness without reason, a peace without circumstance, a sensation that you are anterior to everything that is happening, and from an energetic point of view, that is where your life begins to reorganize itself. Because when the observer returns to the point of rest, the hologram projects a cleaner image. The noise drops, and things that seemed impossible begin to settle into new patterns. It is not a miracle, it is observer physics. And this was exactly what the Gateway process, the CIA program that studied Bentov's work, tried to operationalize. They wanted to know if agents could be trained to reach this state on demand. They wanted to know if the information accessed in this state was reliable. And the document, now public, admits, with a surprising degree of honesty, that yes, that the model worked. That the human body, trained correctly, transforms into an instrument of perception that exceeds the limits of the sensory, and that the theoretical basis of this functioning was, essentially, the stitching that Bentov had done between engineering, meditation, and cosmology. But he went even further, far, because the next piece of his vision is perhaps the most beautiful, and at the same time the most challenging for the rational brain. Bentov did not see the universe as a linear explosion expanding forever into the void. He saw it as a breath, a shape that folds back on itself continuously, a structure that mathematicians call a torus. Imagine a donut with a hole in the middle and a constant flow of energy entering from the top, passing through the center, exiting from the bottom and returning along the sides to enter again. An eternal circuit, a cosmic perpetual motion machine. Bentov claimed that this is the fundamental geometry of everything. The atom breathes this way. The human heart generates an electromagnetic field with this shape. The galaxy organizes itself this way. And the universe itself, as a whole, is a breathing torus, expanding and contracting, creating and reabsorbing, with no linear beginning or end. Within this structure, consciousness is not a byproduct. It is the current that flows through the torus. It is what sustains the flow. And every living being is a small whirlpool within this larger flow, a temporary vortex that captures, processes, and returns information to the field. This radically changes the idea of death, because in a torus, nothing truly leaves. Everything just returns through another face of the same structure. Energy recycles, information is preserved, and what we call evolution in reality is the gradual refinement of this individual vortex, which with each cycle learns to capture more subtle frequencies, to process more complex patterns, to return to the field a more harmonic version of itself. You are not going from a point zero to a final point. You are being polished from within a structure that breathes, and the more coherent you become, the more the structure responds, the more the field collaborates, the more so-called coincidences begin to organize themselves around you, because you have ceased to be noise within the torus, and have become a tuned current. Bentov further described that in very deep states of meditation, he perceived something beyond this geometry. He perceived patterns, patterns that looked like letters, patterns that looked like ancient symbols, Hebrew, Sumerian, Sanskrit, and he did not claim that these letters were there in a mystical sense. He claimed that those shapes, created by ancient civilizations in altered states, were human attempts to draw, with strokes of the alphabet, the invisible structure of primordial energy. As if, upon entering deep coherence, the observer began to see the molds with which reality organizes itself, and as if sacred traditions, long before oscilloscopes, had already catalogued these molds in the form of sacred writing. This connects something that has always seemed absurd to modern scientific thought, the idea that letters, sounds, and mantras have a real effect on matter. Bentov was not saying they have an effect because they are magical. He was saying they have an effect because they are compressed representations of real vibratory patterns. Repeating certain sounds is tuning the body to certain geometries, and by tuning the body, you reorganize the projection. And at the top of this whole structure, Bentov placed a word that no reasonable scientist uses. He used it: love. Not in the sugary sense, in the physical sense. He claimed that the deeper the observer goes into the toroidal structure of the universe, the more he realizes that the organizing principle of everything is an integrating force, a force that stitches, a force that brings the disconnected closer, harmonizes the dissonant and gathers the dispersed, and that this force in the deepest mystical experiences is felt as a loving intelligence, not as an emotion, as a fabric. The fabric itself is made of cohesion. And every time you enter into internal coherence, you enter into resonance with this fabric. Every time you operate from fear, from resentment, from separation, you go out of phase with it. It is not punishment. It is acoustics. There is a frequency of the universe itself, and it is the frequency of union. And the human body is the only living antenna capable of consciously capturing this frequency. And if you follow this reasoning to the end, you arrive at the turning point. The point that Bentov reported having reached in some of his most profound experiences, and which became the silent heart of his entire work. He describes that, at a certain degree of coherence, the observer realizes that he himself is the source of what he is observing. That the boundary between the self and the universe does not disappear because it existed. It disappears because it was never real. You are the torus breathing within itself. You are the hologram folding to contemplate itself. You are the void testing the experience of form. You are at once the creator, the observer, and the observed. And this is not a religious statement. It is a logical consequence of everything his senses showed. If the universe is holographic, every part contains the whole. If every part contains the whole, you contain the entire universe. If you contain the entire universe, then what you call the external world is a projection of your internal field passing through the hologram, not as a delusion, as a structure. And this means that the journey of consciousness, in the end, is not a search for something distant. It is a return. It is the exact feeling that many report when reaching deep mystical states. They do not feel they have discovered something new. They feel they have remembered something they always knew. They return to themselves. And by returning to themselves, they find the entire universe waiting there within. This is why the life of Bentov, even ending so brutally on May 5, 1979, continues to reverberate. Because what he saw cannot be unseen by those who are willing to look. And his wife, Myrtala, by protecting and publishing the notebooks, by insisting on keeping alive a work that the official world preferred to forget, ensured that anyone, decades later, could open this portal. And the most impressive thing is that opening this portal does not require technology. It does not require a degree. It does not require permission. It requires what Bentov always said. It requires silence. It requires breath. It requires the courage to sit, close your eyes, and let the body find on its own the rhythm of the 7 hertz. It requires the willingness to touch, even if for a few seconds a day, the point of rest between one heartbeat and the next. It requires mainly the understanding that the life that unfolds around you is not luck, not destiny, not chance. It is a mirror. It is a reflection. It is the faithful projection of the internal state in which your biology spent most of the last 24 hours. If you woke up tense, went through the day accelerated, slept anxious, the hologram will return a tense, accelerated, and anxious life. Not because the universe is cruel, because the universe is precise. And at the exact moment you begin to change your internal state, even if slowly, even if for a few minutes a day, the projection begins to change around you. People begin to respond differently. Opportunities begin to present themselves through paths you didn't even see before. The body begins to heal things that medicine couldn't explain. It is not magic. It is engineering of consciousness applied to one's own organism. It is Bentov, in the language of the laboratory, saying what mystics have said for millennia in the language of the temple. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about all this is the simplicity of the conclusion. After all the experiments, all the graphs, all the theories about cosmic tori, universal holograms and planetary resonances, what Bentov left as a silent testament was a sentence he never wrote in those exact words, but which emerges whole from everything he investigated. You do not need to reach the universe. You need to stop running from yourself, because the entire universe is already folded inside you, waiting for your attention to come back home. And when the attention returns, the body calms down. When the body calms down, the heart enters into phase with the brain. When the heart enters into phase with the brain, the field around it organizes itself. When the field around it organizes itself, life begins to reflect on the outside what has finally been established within. And that is when a person understands, irreversibly, that they were never separate from anything, that the search ended before it even began, that the observer and the observed were always the same thing, playing at forgetting, playing at searching, playing at rediscovering one another. And on the day that this realization hits, one thing becomes evident. Itzhak Bentov did not die on Flight 191. He merely crossed one of the faces of the torus, and he left, for whoever had the courage to look, the map of how to make the same journey back to oneself without needing to board any plane. The map is in your chest, the instrument is in your body, the frequency is waiting. And now that you know this, the only gesture that remains is the simplest of all, and at the same time the most radical. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and remember, in the flesh, that the reality out there can only change when the antenna in here finally decides to tune into a different channel.